In a world where kings ruled by the sword, one man rose not just to conquer lands, but to conquer destiny itself. His name was Richard the Lionheart, a king whose courage echoed through centuries, whose battles shook empires, and whose faith turned defeat into wisdom. This is not just the story of a warrior. It's the journey of a man who found the strength to rise after being broken, who learned that true power isn't found in a throne. It's forged in the heart that refuses to surrender. Every warrior fights two battles, one against the enemy and one against himself. Richard faced both. He was betrayed, imprisoned, and forgotten by those he once protected. But the Lionheart did not kneel. He turned his pain into patience, his chains into strength, and his silence into victory. This is the untold story of how a king learned that sometimes the greatest empire you'll ever build is the one within your soul. Richard Plantagenet, later known as Richard the Lionheart*, was born into one of the most powerful royal families of medieval Europe, yet his early life was far from a tale of comfort and peace. Born in 1157, he was the son of King Henry Roman II of England and Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most influential queens in history. From his earliest years, Richard lived in an environment filled with ambition, rivalry, and the constant tension of power. The royal court was not just a place of luxury, it was a battlefield of minds and motives. Every smile could hide a scheme, every favor could be a trap. In such a world, Richard learned early that strength was not a gift, it was a responsibility. As a child, Richard showed qualities that set him apart from his brothers. He was intelligent, bold, and fearless. While others sought to please, he sought to understand. He listened to stories of warriors and leaders who ruled with justice and courage, and he began to shape his own vision of what a true ruler should be. He spent hours training in swordsmanship, riding, and military tactics. His mother, Eleanor, recognized his natural leadership and ensured he was educated not only in warfare, but in governance, poetry, and diplomacy. From her, he inherited a love of culture and wisdom. From his father, the sharpness of mind and the will to command. But growing up in a royal family also meant living under pressure. His father, King Henry Roman II, ruled over England and large parts of France, but he was often at odds with his sons. Richard witnessed arguments that tore the royal household apart. He saw how pride and suspicion could destroy even the strongest alliances. These family conflicts would later teach him that a kingdom cannot be held by fear. It must be guided by loyalty and justice. In his heart, Richard vowed that when his time came, he would lead not through tyranny but through trust. In his teenage years, Richard began to show his courage on the battlefield. He was given command of his own troops in the region of Aquitaine, a land known for rebellion and unrest. Most young princes would have failed under such pressure, but Richard thrived. He rode at the front lines, inspiring soldiers with his bravery. When danger arose, he faced it head-on, earning the respect of even his enemies. It was during these years that his men began to call him Coeur de Lion, the Lionheart, because his courage roared louder than fear. Richard's early victories were not without hardship. The nobles of Aquitaine often resisted his rule, and he faced constant revolt. Yet, rather than ruling through cruelty, he showed both firmness and fairness. When rebellion rose, he fought with strategy. When peace was possible, he offered mercy. His ability to balance power with wisdom made him not just a feared warrior, but a respected leader. He learned that true strength is not about dominating others, it is about mastering oneself. Despite his growing fame, Richard's relationship with his father became strained. King Henry Roman, too, feared his son's rising power and popularity. The tension between them deepened, and soon Richard found himself caught between loyalty to his father and loyalty to his own principles. In these years, he experienced betrayal from within his own family, a wound that would later make him wary of false allies. But even through this pain, he never lost his sense of honor. He understood that leadership is a lonely road, one where trust must be earned, not given freely. As he matured, Richard's vision expanded beyond his own lands. He began to see himself as part of something greater, a defender of justice, a protector of his people. He studied history, learning from the triumphs and failures of rulers before him. He knew that a king's legacy was not built in moments of ease, but in times of trial. This belief would guide him for the rest of his life, shaping every decision he made when the weight of the crown finally rested on his head. Even in his youth, Richard carried himself with the dignity of a king. He was tall, strong, and carried an air of confidence that inspired loyalty. But more than his appearance, it was his heart that set him apart. He spoke with conviction, valued honesty, and stood firm in his beliefs. Those who followed him felt not only his command but his sincerity. He didn't demand loyalty, he earned it through example. The people of Aquitaine and England began to speak of him as the future of the kingdom. They saw in him the qualities they longed for: courage, justice, and strength guided by wisdom. His name spread beyond his lands, reaching courts and kingdoms across Europe. Even before he wore the crown, his reputation was already being forged in the fires of experience. Every battle, every decision, and every hardship became part of the foundation upon which his future greatness would stand. By the time Richard reached adulthood, he had faced more trials than most men could endure in a lifetime. He had seen betrayal, led armies, faced revolts, and learned the cost of power, yet he stood unbroken, wiser and stronger than before. The boy who had grown up amidst the noise of conflict had become a man of vision, courage, and faith in his destiny. The world was changing, and Richard knew his moment was near, the time when the Lionheart would rise and the world would hear his roar. Before Richard ever wore the crown, his life was a constant preparation for the challenges that awaited him. He grew up surrounded by the chaos of royal politics, a house divided by ambition. His father, King Henry Roman II, was a strong ruler, but also a man burdened by the pride of power. His brothers, Geoffrey and John, each desired influence and control, leading to endless rivalries. Richard found himself caught in the middle of this storm, where loyalty was tested daily, and every decision carried risk. He learned early that peace in a royal family was fragile, and that trust, even among blood, must be earned through integrity, not titles. When Richard was still young, he witnessed his father's conflicts with noblemen across his vast territories in France. The English crown ruled lands stretching from Scotland to the Pyrenees, but this power came with rebellion and resistance. Richard, even as a prince, was often sent to suppress revolts. These missions were not only military tasks, but lessons in leadership. He learned how to read people, how to turn enemies into allies, and how to inspire loyalty in uncertain times. Every small victory in those early years shaped him into a man who would one day command thousands with both respect and authority. By his late teens, Richard had earned a reputation as a skilled commander. His courage was unmatched, his discipline unwavering. In the provinces of Aquitaine, where rebellion was a way of life, Richard faced powerful lords who refused to submit to royal rule. He fought them not only with his sword but with strategy. He built alliances, fortified castles, and used diplomacy when force alone was not enough. These battles taught him that power is not sustained through fear. It is maintained through wisdom, justice, and courage. His people began to see him not only as a prince, but as a true leader who would stand beside them in times of danger. However, his greatest challenge came from within his own family. His father's mistrust grew as Richard's popularity rose. Henry feared that his son's growing power would one day threaten his throne. This tension turned into open conflict as Richard and his brothers rebelled against their father's authority. It was a painful chapter in Richard's life, one where the young prince had to choose between loyalty to his father and loyalty to his principles. He learned the painful truth that sometimes destiny requires sacrifice, and that the path to greatness often passes through struggle. The wars between father and sons tore the royal family apart. Yet, even in the heat of rebellion, Richard never forgot his values. He showed restraint when others sought vengeance, and he fought with honor even against those he loved. These experiences hardened him, but also deepened his understanding of leadership. He realized that kingship was not about controlling others. It was about mastering one's emotions, standing firm in faith, and holding onto truth even when surrounded by betrayal. This was a lesson he would carry for the rest of his life. As the years passed, Richard's command of strategy grew remarkable. He studied every campaign, learning from both victory and defeat. He trained himself not only in the art of battle, but in patience and observation. He could read the rhythm of war like a poet reads his verses, seeing patterns, anticipating moves, and acting with precision. When others rushed into combat blinded by pride, Richard calculated. This ability to stay calm in chaos would later define him as one of the greatest military minds of his age. Despite his conflicts with his father, Richard never abandoned his sense of duty toward his people. He built fortifications to protect towns, improved local laws, and encouraged fairness among the nobles under his command. Even his enemies came to respect his discipline and justice. He became known as a prince who ruled with both fire and fairness, a rare combination that earned him the loyalty of soldiers and citizens alike. Those who followed him felt they were part of something greater than a royal campaign. They were serving a man whose vision was guided by honor. When King Henry Roman II's health began to decline, the struggle for succession grew fierce. Richard's younger brother, John, sought to seize control through deceit, whispering lies into their father's ear. Yet, fate favored Richard. As the rightful heir, his courage and leadership could no longer be denied. Even Henry, before his final breath, recognized Richard's strength and named him his successor. This moment, though filled with sorrow, marked the beginning of Richard's rise. The prince forged through conflict was now the king destined to lead. When Richard finally ascended to the throne in 1189, England stood on the edge of transformation. The young king carried scars from years of conflict, but also wisdom earned through experience. He understood that the throne was not a reward but a responsibility. His early battles had taught him that authority must be balanced with compassion, and that a ruler's true strength lies not in his crown but in his character. His people rejoiced, for they saw in him a leader who would restore unity and honor to the kingdom. The prince who had grown up amid betrayal and bloodshed was now prepared to rule a nation not as a tyrant, but as a warrior guided by discipline and justice. His story was no longer about survival, it was about purpose. The lessons learned in his youth would soon be tested on a grander stage, where destiny awaited him beyond the seas. And thus began the journey of King Richard the Lionheart, the king who would carry his courage to lands far beyond his own. When news reached England that Jerusalem had fallen into the hands of foreign forces, the world of Christendom trembled. For many rulers, this was a distant concern, but for Richard, it was a calling that stirred something deep within his soul. He saw it not merely as a war, but as a test of destiny, a test that would measure the strength of his heart, his discipline, and his faith in justice. To him, the fall of Jerusalem symbolized more than a loss of land. It represented a challenge to courage, honor, and the unity of believers across nations. Richard felt that this was the moment he had been prepared for his entire life, to stand for something greater than his crown. Before setting out, Richard made preparations that would astonish Europe. He gathered his armies, organized supplies, and forged alliances with other rulers who shared his purpose. He knew that a journey to the Holy Lands would test not just his sword, but his leadership. He sold many royal treasures to fund the campaign, showing the world that his mission was not driven by greed but by conviction. This was not a campaign of pride, but one of principle. Every choice he made was deliberate, every action planned with patience and foresight. Richard was not rushing to war. He was answering a higher call to fulfill what he believed was his duty as a leader. The journey itself began with both glory and hardship. Ships carrying thousands of men set sail from Europe toward lands unknown to most of them. The sea was unpredictable, and many of his vessels were struck by storms. Men grew seasick, supplies spoiled, and morale began to waver. Yet Richard remained steady. He moved among his soldiers, speaking with them, reminding them that every hardship was a test of their strength. When storms struck, he ordered his men to pray instead of despair. When hunger came, he shared their rations. These moments proved that a true leader walks with his people, not ahead of them. When his fleet finally reached the shores of the Mediterranean, they faced yet another challenge. The lands they entered were unfamiliar, the climate harsh, and the enemies formidable. The desert sun beat down on the soldiers' armor, and water was scarce. But where others saw suffering, Richard saw opportunity. He encouraged his army to adapt, to learn from the local terrain, and to build strength from endurance. He knew that victory was not just about the sword, it was about spirit. The man who controls his own fear can overcome any battlefield. Among the kings who had joined the campaign, Richard's leadership quickly stood out. He was disciplined, strategic, and decisive. While others hesitated, he acted. His confidence inspired his allies and intimidated his opponents. But what truly set him apart was his sense of fairness. Even in war, he believed in maintaining respect for others. He gave strict orders that civilians should not be harmed, showing mercy when others demanded vengeance. His character reflected a balance between strength and compassion, between power and principle, a rare quality in an age of conquest. As the armies marched closer to their goal, Richard faced another test, the conflict of leadership among fellow kings. Pride and rivalry began to divide the coalition. Some leaders sought personal glory. Others grew weary of the long campaign. But Richard kept his focus clear. He reminded his men that they were not fighting for themselves, but for something higher. His words rekindled their purpose, restoring unity among those who were losing hope. He led by example, showing that greatness does not come from command, but from conviction. During one critical moment, Richard's ship was lost to a storm, and he was separated from much of his fleet. Many thought he would perish, but the Lionheart refused to surrender to fate. Against all odds, he and his men reached safety, regrouped, and continued forward. This episode became a legend among his followers, proof that their king's courage was not a tale but a truth. He taught them that faith, endurance, and strategy could turn even disaster into destiny. Every mile of that journey shaped Richard into more than a warrior. It shaped him into a symbol of persistence. He faced not only external enemies, but the inner battle of doubt and exhaustion. Nights were spent under the open sky, where he would pray for strength and clarity. He understood that leadership was not about shouting commands, but about giving people hope when they had none. His calmness in chaos became his greatest weapon, and his men began to see him not just as their king, but as their guiding light. The closer they came to the battlefield, the more legends began to form around him. Tales spread of his courage, his wisdom, and his unshakable resolve. Soldiers who had been ready to turn back now marched forward with renewed faith, inspired by their king's unwavering heart. Richard's journey had transformed from a military expedition into a movement of spirit and unity. The man who had once fought for his father's kingdom was now fighting for something eternal, the victory of righteousness over despair. By the time Richard reached the lands of conflict, he was no longer just a monarch. He had become a legend in motion. His presence alone inspired armies, and his strategy would soon change the course of history. What began as a response to the fall of Jerusalem had now become the rise of the Lionheart, a leader forged not in luxury or comfort, but in endurance, courage, and faith that no hardship could destroy. When news reached England that Jerusalem had fallen into the hands of foreign forces, the world of Christendom trembled. For many rulers, this was a distant concern, but for Richard, it was a calling that stirred something deep within his soul. He saw it not merely as a war, but as a test of destiny, a test that would measure the strength of his heart, his discipline, and his faith in justice. To him, the fall of Jerusalem symbolized more than a loss of land. It represented a challenge to courage, honor, and the unity of believers across nations. Richard felt that this was the moment he had been prepared for his entire life, to stand for something greater than his crown. Before setting out, Richard made preparations that would astonish Europe. He gathered his armies, organized supplies, and forged alliances with other rulers who shared his purpose. He knew that a journey to the Holy Lands would test not just his sword, but his leadership. He sold many royal treasures to fund the campaign, showing the world that his mission was not driven by greed but by conviction. This was not a campaign of pride but one of principle. Every choice he made was deliberate, every action planned with patience and foresight. Richard was not rushing to war. He was answering a higher call to fulfill what he believed was his duty as a leader. The journey itself began with both glory and hardship. Ships carrying thousands of men set sail from Europe toward lands unknown to most of them. The sea was unpredictable, and many of his vessels were struck by storms. Men grew seasick, supplies spoiled, and morale began to waver. Yet Richard remained steady. He moved among his soldiers, speaking with them, reminding them that every hardship was a test of their strength. When storms struck, he ordered his men to pray instead of despair. When hunger came, he shared their rations. These moments proved that a true leader walks with his people, not ahead of them. When his fleet finally reached the shores of the Mediterranean, they faced yet another challenge. The lands they entered were unfamiliar, the climate harsh, and the enemies formidable. The desert sun beat down on the soldiers' armor, and water was scarce. But where others saw suffering, Richard saw opportunity. He encouraged his army to adapt, to learn from the local terrain, and to build strength from endurance. He knew that victory was not just about the sword, it was about spirit. The man who controls his own fear can overcome any battlefield. Among the kings who had joined the campaign, Richard's leadership quickly stood out. He was disciplined, strategic, and decisive. While others hesitated, he acted. His confidence inspired his allies and intimidated his opponents. But what truly set him apart was his sense of fairness. Even in war, he believed in maintaining respect for others. He gave strict orders that civilians should not be harmed, showing mercy when others demanded vengeance. His character reflected a balance between strength and compassion, between power and principle, a rare quality in an age of conquest. As the armies marched closer to their goal, Richard faced another test, the conflict of leadership among fellow kings. Pride and rivalry began to divide the coalition. Some leaders sought personal glory, others grew weary of the long campaign. But Richard kept his focus clear. He reminded his men that they were not fighting for themselves, but for something higher. His words rekindled their purpose, restoring unity among those who were losing hope. He led by example, showing that greatness does not come from command, but from conviction. During one critical moment, Richard's ship was lost to a storm, and he was separated from much of his fleet. Many thought he would perish, but the Lionheart refused to surrender to fate. Against all odds, he and his men reached safety, regrouped, and continued forward. This episode became a legend among his followers, proof that their king's courage was not a tale, but a truth. He taught them that faith, endurance, and strategy could turn even disaster into destiny. Every mile of that journey shaped Richard into more than a warrior. It shaped him into a symbol of persistence. He faced not only external enemies but the inner battle of doubt and exhaustion. Nights were spent under the open sky where he would pray for strength and clarity. He understood that leadership was not about shouting commands, but about giving people hope when they had none. His calmness in chaos became his greatest weapon, and his men began to see him not just as their king, but as their guiding light. The closer they came to the battlefield, the more legends began to form around him. Tales spread of his courage, his wisdom, and his unshakable resolve. Soldiers who had been ready to turn back now marched forward with renewed faith, inspired by their king's unwavering heart. Richard's journey had transformed from a military expedition into a movement of spirit and unity. The man who had once fought for his father's kingdom was now fighting for something eternal, the victory of righteousness over despair. By the time Richard reached the lands of conflict, he was no longer just a monarch. He had become a legend in motion. His presence alone inspired armies, and his strategy would soon change the course of history. What began as a response to the fall of Jerusalem had now become the rise of the Lionheart, a leader forged not in luxury or comfort, but in endurance, courage, and faith that no hardship could destroy. When King Richard took the throne, Europe was filled with stories of faith, valor, and holy duty. The Third Crusade had already begun, and news of Jerusalem, the sacred city, being under the control of Muslim forces, had reached every corner of Christendom. For Richard, this was not merely a political matter. It was a call that reached his heart, a divine test of his courage and faith. The idea of reclaiming the Holy Land stirred something deep within him. To him, it was not about power or conquest. It was about fulfilling what he believed to be a spiritual duty. From the moment he declared his intention to join the crusade, the whole of England felt his resolve. He began to prepare his army with discipline and purpose. He sold royal lands, emptied treasures, and even made alliances with old rivals to fund the expedition. Every action reflected his determination. People across the realm admired his willingness to sacrifice wealth for a higher cause. This commitment showed his people that a true leader doesn't just speak of faith, he acts upon it. But Richard's decision also came with great challenges. To lead thousands of men across continents to foreign lands filled with uncertainty required not only strength but wisdom. He knew the crusade would test him physically, mentally, and spiritually. As ships were built and supplies gathered, he prayed for guidance. The weight of the crown did not weaken his will. It strengthened his sense of purpose. Every morning before dawn, he trained with his men, showing them that their king was not a distant ruler but a warrior who would fight beside them. When Richard's fleet finally set sail, the sight was breathtaking. Hundreds of ships carrying soldiers, horses, and banners painted with the cross. The wind carried their songs of faith and hope as the shores of England faded in the distance. Richard stood on the deck, gazing toward the horizon, knowing he was leaving his homeland to face destiny. His courage became a symbol for his men. He reminded them that victory did not depend on numbers or weapons, but on faith, discipline, and unity. The journey itself was far from easy. Storms scattered the fleet, supplies ran low, and disease struck many. Yet Richard never wavered. He walked among his men, encouraging them, tending to the wounded, and keeping morale high. His presence gave them strength. They began to call him not just their king, but their Lionheart, for his spirit refused to bend under hardship. This title, earned through his actions, would forever define his legacy. When Richard reached the shores of the Mediterranean, he found not only allies, but also rivals among the European leaders. Political games and pride stood in the way of unity. Yet Richard rose above these divisions. He spoke with clarity, reminding them that they had not come for glory or gold, but for faith. His words inspired even those who doubted him. Slowly, he brought order among the Crusaders, proving that a true king leads with both strength and humility. The battles that followed were fierce and unrelenting. Under the burning sun, Richard led his men against formidable opponents. The Muslim forces, led by the great commander Salahuddin Ayyub, known as Saladin, were disciplined, strategic, and deeply devoted to their cause. Richard respected them, for he saw in Saladin a reflection of his own faith and courage. Though they stood on opposite sides, both fought with honor. Richard's conduct in battle, his bravery, fairness, and refusal to harm the innocent, earned him respect even from his enemies. In one famous clash, Richard's forces faced overwhelming odds. Many thought retreat was inevitable. Yet Richard rode to the front lines, sword in hand, shouting words that rekindled hope in his soldiers' hearts. His armor glistened in the sunlight, and his courage turned fear into determination. That day they held their ground and won. It was not just a victory of arms, but of spirit. The men knew that under Richard's command they followed a leader who valued honor above all else. Through years of campaign, Richard's name spread across nations. He became a symbol of courage and faithfulness. Even when peace negotiations began, he dealt with Saladin with dignity and respect, showing the world that strength and compassion could coexist. Their correspondence became legendary, two warriors, two leaders, acknowledging the greatness in each other. Such mutual respect was rare in times of war, but it revealed the nobility within Richard's heart. Though Richard did not reclaim Jerusalem, he secured peace that allowed Christian pilgrims safe passage to the holy city, a victory that was both moral and spiritual. When he finally returned home, he carried not gold or crowns, but lessons. He had learned that true conquest is not over land, but over one's ego. His faith had been tested and his courage refined. The crusade had turned him from a warrior king into a man of purpose. His story would echo through centuries as one of bravery, discipline, and leadership founded on faith. When Richard set his course back to England after years of war, he did not imagine that his journey home would become as dangerous as the battles he had fought. The crusade had tested his sword, but now destiny would test his patience, his endurance, and his faith. As his ships sailed through turbulent waters, storms scattered them far from safe harbors. Richard found himself stranded in foreign lands, cut off from his army and without the protection of his loyal knights. The Lionheart, once the most feared warrior in the East, was now a lone traveler surrounded by enemies. Disguised as a humble pilgrim, Richard tried to make his way across Europe to return to England, but fate had other plans. His fame, like a double-edged sword, made it impossible to remain hidden. Every land he crossed whispered of his valor, the warrior who faced Saladin, the king who inspired armies. Yet that same reputation betrayed him. In Austria, he was recognized by Duke Leopold, a man who bore old grudges from the crusade. The Duke ordered his arrest, and Richard the mighty Lionheart was taken in chains. For the first time, Richard faced a trial he could not fight with his sword. His enemies did not come at him with armies, but with greed. The Duke sold him to the Holy Roman Emperor Henry VI, who demanded a ransom so vast it seemed impossible to pay. Word of his capture spread like wildfire across Europe, reaching England like a shadow over the sun. The people wept not for a king of gold and crown, but for the warrior who had fought for them with heart and honor. While Richard sat in a cold stone cell, his thoughts were not of despair but reflection. He prayed for strength and guidance. He realized that even a king, stripped of his throne and armor, was still a servant of destiny. The chains on his wrists were heavy, but they could not bind his spirit. He spoke to his captors with calm and dignity, reminding them that honor was worth more than silver. Even in captivity, Richard remained a king, not because of power, but because of his character. Back in England, his mother, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, took charge. She became the voice of her son's freedom. She sent letters, raised funds, and appealed to the people. Towns gave their gold, nobles their silver, and even the poor contributed pennies. The land united for their king. This unity became a testament to the love Richard had earned through his leadership. His people didn't just see him as a ruler, they saw him as their champion. In prison, Richard was allowed to play the lute, and it was said that his songs echoed through the halls, tales of courage, loss, and faith. His music became a symbol of hope. It reminded those who guarded him that the man they held captive was more than a warrior. He was a leader who inspired loyalty even from afar. One of his loyal knights, Blundell, traveled across Europe, singing Richard's melodies until he found the cell where his king was held. When Richard heard the familiar tune and answered back, the legend of loyalty and brotherhood was born. The ransom demanded was enormous, 150,000 marks, equal to the wealth of several kingdoms, yet the English people paid it. They melted their treasures, sacrificed luxuries, and gave what they could. This act showed that real power lies not in fear, but in love and respect. When the last coin was counted and the ransom was paid, the chains were removed. The Lionheart walked free once again, not broken but reborn. His captivity had not weakened him, it had refined him. As he stepped into the sunlight after months in darkness, Richard understood something profound, that kingship was not about command, but about character. He had seen both loyalty and betrayal, greed and generosity, pride and humility. These lessons were more valuable than any crown. His heart, once filled with the roar of battle, now carried the quiet wisdom of endurance. He had learned that true greatness is not only shown in victory, but in how one endures defeat. When Richard finally returned to England, the people greeted him not with ceremonies, but with tears of joy. Bells rang from every church, songs filled the air, and the land rejoiced as their Lionheart came home. He had faced storms, captivity, and betrayal, yet returned with his faith and spirit intact. His trials became a living message that no chain is strong enough to bind a man who refuses to surrender his heart. Though the crown was placed once again upon his head, Richard no longer wore it for power. He wore it as a reminder that leadership is service, strength is humility, and freedom is earned not by gold or armies, but by patience, perseverance, and faith. The world remembered him not just as a conqueror, but as the king who faced imprisonment and returned stronger, wiser, and truer than before. His story became a timeless lesson in resilience that even a lion, when caged, never forgets how to roar. When Richard finally set foot on English soil again, his heart was heavy with memories of chains, betrayal, and hardship, yet his eyes still burned with the fire of purpose. He was no longer the same man who had left years before, filled only with dreams of conquest. He had seen the depths of human greed and the heights of loyalty. He had tasted both the bitterness of defeat and the sweetness of deliverance. Now his mission was no longer to win wars abroad, but to restore strength, unity, and justice within his own land. England had suffered during his absence, and Richard knew that a true king's duty was not just to conquer, but to rebuild. Upon returning, Richard found that his throne was not as stable as it once was. His brother, Prince John, had tried to seize power while he was imprisoned, spreading deceit and fear among the nobles. Many had turned their loyalty towards self-interest, believing that the Lionheart would never return. But when word spread that Richard was alive, a wave of awe swept across the realm. His very name carried weight not of tyranny, but of courage and divine justice. The people gathered to see him ride through the streets, not with the pride of a ruler, but the humility of a man who had walked through fire and come out purified. Richard did not return to punish those who betrayed him. Instead, he chose to forgive, understanding that mercy strengthens a kingdom far more than vengeance. He addressed his council and said, "Let us rebuild what has been broken, not with hatred, but with honor." His words struck deeply into the hearts of his nobles. The Lionheart had learned the greatest lesson of all, that true power is not shown in striking fear, but in inspiring respect. His example began to heal divisions across the land, bringing together those who had once stood apart. He began reforming the system of governance, ensuring that the taxes raised for his ransom would not cripple the poor. He strengthened the laws, emphasizing justice over favoritism. Richard wanted a kingdom where no man was above righteousness and no soul beneath compassion. His leadership carried a quiet dignity that came not from royal pride, but from the scars of experience. He was no longer the youthful warrior chasing glory, but a seasoned ruler guided by wisdom. To rebuild his military and secure peace, Richard began fortifying castles, training soldiers, and re-establishing alliances. Yet, unlike before, his campaigns were not driven by greed for land or titles. They were designed to protect his people and maintain order. He encouraged discipline and courage among his men, teaching them that a warrior's strength lies not in aggression, but in restraint. He reminded them that the mightiest sword is the one controlled by faith and wisdom. In his time of rebuilding, Richard also turned his attention to his faith. He ordered the repair of churches, supported scholars, and funded the creation of new schools for the poor. He understood that a nation built only on warfare would crumble, but a nation grounded in knowledge and virtue would endure. He sought to leave behind not merely walls and castles, but minds enlightened with truth and hearts guided by moral strength. His transformation from warrior to wise ruler became the foundation of his redemption. Even though his health began to decline, Richard continued to travel across his lands, personally resolving disputes and restoring justice where corruption had taken root. He walked among his soldiers, spoke to the common folk, and listened to their grievances. The people no longer saw him as a distant monarch, but as a protector who truly understood their struggles. Every decision he made reflected a balance between strength and compassion, showing that a true leader serves before he commands. In his final years, Richard's focus turned toward ensuring peace among neighboring realms. He sought treaties and alliances that would spare England the endless cycles of war that had plagued Europe. Though once known for his fiery spirit on the battlefield, now his greatest victories were those won through negotiation and wisdom. The same courage that once drove him into war now guided him toward peace. He realized that his legacy would not be the blood spilled in battle, but the peace he left behind. As he looked back upon his journey from the deserts of the Crusades to the darkness of his imprisonment, and finally to the throne he had regained, Richard understood the deeper purpose behind every trial. His captivity had purified his heart, his losses had deepened his faith, and his return had taught him the sacred weight of responsibility. Every scar on his body told a story, not of pain, but of perseverance. His reign became a testament to the belief that a man's true greatness lies not in how he rises, but in how he rebuilds after he falls. The people of England came to love him not because he was perfect, but because he was human, a warrior who had erred, suffered, and learned. His story became a symbol of redemption and resilience, teaching generations that even kings must be tested to understand the value of mercy and justice. Richard the Lionheart's final years were not defined by the battles he won, but by the peace he forged and the legacy he left, a reminder that no defeat is final for the one who rises again with faith and courage. In the final chapters of Richard's life, the Lionheart once again found himself drawn to the call of battle. Not for conquest, nor for pride, but for protection. The borders of his realm were threatened by those who mistook his humility for weakness. His rivals believed that age and hardship had softened him, that the once mighty warrior had lost his flame. But they had forgotten one truth: a lion may rest, but it never forgets how to roar. When Richard heard of rebellion and betrayal rising in his lands, he mounted his horse once more, his sword gleaming beneath the English sky. The king, who had endured storms, imprisonment, and deceit, now prepared to defend the peace he had worked so hard to build. The campaigns that followed were not great crusades or vast invasions. They were smaller, more personal battles, each one fought to secure justice, defend the weak, and punish treachery. Richard's experience had taught him that every battle has a cost, and now he chose them carefully. He no longer fought for glory, but for principle. The men who rode beside him did not see a monarch on a throne, but a warrior among them, their leader, their brother, their Lionheart. His presence on the battlefield still ignited courage in the hearts of his soldiers, reminding them that faith, unity, and discipline could conquer even the darkest fear. One of his final campaigns took him to the lands of Limousin in France, where a local lord had rebelled against his authority. Though Richard could have sent his armies to crush the uprising, he led them himself, determined to bring justice with his own hand. To him, leadership meant standing where danger was greatest, not commanding from safety. As he marched through muddy fields and broken villages, he saw the damage greed and arrogance caused among men. His heart, once stirred by the sound of war drums, now longed for peace, but he knew peace could not exist without order, and order required courage. During the siege of a small fortress, Richard's fate took an unexpected turn. He rode too close to the walls, inspecting the defenses, when a single crossbow bolt struck him in the shoulder. The wound seemed small at first, but infection soon set in. The warrior who had survived blades, storms, and prisons was now brought low by a single arrow. Yet even in pain, his spirit remained unshaken. He refused to show weakness before his men. With calm resolve, he continued to give orders, ensuring that the siege was won and justice served. As he lay wounded in his tent, surrounded by loyal knights and servants, Richard's thoughts drifted across his life. He remembered the deserts of the Crusades, the long nights in captivity, the prayers whispered in the dark, and the faces of those who had stood by him through it all. The noise of battle faded into the quiet hum of memory. He had fought not merely against enemies, but against despair, greed, and betrayal, the true wars every leader must face. His heart, though failing, was filled with gratitude, for he had lived not as a man of comfort, but as one of purpose. When they brought before him the young man who had fired the fatal shot, his knights expected wrath, but Richard, weakened yet resolute, chose mercy. He looked at the boy and saw not an enemy, but a soul misled by ignorance and ambition, the same forces he himself had struggled against. "You are forgiven," he said softly. It was a moment of divine clarity. The mighty Lionheart, who had once lived by the sword, now chose compassion as his final act of strength. His mercy stunned all who witnessed it. The king who could have taken life instead gave grace. In his final days, Richard's mother, Queen Eleanor, came to his side. The once great warrior rested in her care as a son rather than a ruler. He confessed his regrets, his hopes, and his faith. He spoke of the lessons he had learned, that victory without virtue was hollow, that courage meant nothing without compassion, and that every crown is only borrowed for as long as one serves justly. He knew his time was near, yet his voice remained steady. "Let my heart be remembered not for battle," he said, "but for mercy." When Richard the Lionheart passed away, all of England mourned. Bells tolled from every church tower, knights laid down their swords, and commoners wept for the king who had fought and forgiven, conquered and rebuilt. He was buried with honor, but it was said that his spirit lived on in every soldier who fought for justice, in every ruler who chose faith over pride, and in every man who rose after defeat. His legacy was not carved in stone, but written in hearts. Throughout the ages, stories of his bravery and compassion traveled across lands. Bards sang of his courage, scholars wrote of his wisdom, and leaders reflected on his humility. The world remembered him not just as a warrior, but as a man transformed by trial. He had started as a fiery conqueror, but ended as a king who understood the value of mercy and redemption. His life became a living testament to the idea that strength and goodness are not enemies, but companions in the hearts of the noble. The legend of Richard the Lionheart endures as a symbol of faith, resilience, and leadership. His journey from triumph to defeat, from chains to freedom, from vengeance to forgiveness, teaches that the greatest victory a man can achieve is mastery over himself. His roar still echoes across centuries, not in the sound of battle, but in the call to rise above anger, to stand firm in justice, and to lead with compassion. The lion may have fallen, but his spirit remains unbroken, a beacon for all who believe that true kingship lies not in conquest, but in the courage to forgive. Centuries have passed since Richard the Lionheart walked the earth, yet his name continues to echo through the corridors of history. His story is more than a tale of kings and battles. It is a reflection of the human spirit's capacity to endure, evolve, and rise above trial. The world remembers him not only for his victories, but for the transformation of his heart. He began as a young prince chasing glory, and ended as a wise ruler who understood the deeper purpose of power. His legacy is not merely written in the chronicles of war, but carved into the lessons he left for every generation that followed. One of the greatest lessons from Richard's life is that courage without humility is incomplete. In his youth, he sought fame on the battlefield, fighting for honor and dominion. But through defeat, captivity, and pain, he learned that true greatness does not lie in how loudly one roars, but in how calmly one endures. His strength evolved from physical might to moral resilience. When his body was imprisoned, his spirit remained free, and that freedom of heart is what made him truly great. He showed the world that leadership is not about commanding others, it is about mastering oneself. Richard's trials also revealed the divine wisdom hidden within hardship. When he was betrayed, when he sat in a dark cell far from his kingdom, he could have surrendered to bitterness. Yet he used his suffering as a forge for his character. Every loss became a lesson, every pain a teacher. The man who once led armies learned to lead his own soul. In that transformation lies a timeless truth that adversity is not sent to destroy us, but to refine us. His life reminds us that even kings are tested, and that faith and perseverance are the true weapons of victory. Another lesson Richard's life teaches is the value of mercy over vengeance. In an age when power was often measured by cruelty, he showed compassion. When the man who had shot him was brought before him, Richard could have answered violence with violence. Instead, he forgave. That act of forgiveness was more powerful than any battle he ever fought. It proved that mercy is not weakness, but the highest form of strength. Through that single act, he turned his final moment into an eternal message that true nobility lies not in conquest, but in compassion. Richard's story also stands as a lesson in leadership. He showed that the mightiest kings are those who stand beside their people, not above them. When he returned from captivity, he didn't punish his subjects for their doubts. He united them through justice and service. His reign became a partnership between ruler and people. He taught that a kingdom cannot be built on fear, but only on trust and fairness. Even today, his name inspires leaders to rule not through dominance, but through wisdom and empathy. The Lionheart's journey also demonstrates the importance of faith in the face of uncertainty. He lived in a world of war and politics, but he never lost his belief in a higher purpose. When every worldly support was stripped away, his armies, his freedom, his crown, faith remained his anchor. He prayed in silence, trusted in divine justice, and walked through trials with patience. His life shows that faith is not a shield from hardship, but a light that guides one through it. His victories on earth may have faded, but his faith made his legacy eternal. Richard's transformation from conqueror to redeemer holds a mirror to every human soul. We all begin our journey seeking to prove ourselves to the world, chasing titles, recognition, and success. But the true victory comes when we realize that the greatest conquest is not of lands, but of ego. His story tells us that honor is not found in being obeyed, but in being remembered for goodness. The Lionheart's redemption shows that no matter how far one strays in pursuit of glory, it is never too late to return to truth and righteousness. His story also stands as a warning that unchecked pride leads to downfall, and humility leads to renewal. Richard's early ambition brought him glory but also loss, yet when he embraced humility, he found peace. He learned that crowns can be taken, but integrity cannot. This lesson remains vital for every generation. Power and wealth fade, but the strength of character endures forever. The Lionheart's life reminds us that our worth is not measured by what we possess, but by what we give back to others. Even beyond England, Richard's legend became a symbol of courage and justice. His actions inspired tales, songs, and poems across Europe. But behind the legend stands a real man, flawed, faithful, and brave. His humanity is what makes his story timeless. He was not perfect, but he strove to do right, and in doing so, became immortal in memory. He showed that even the strongest warriors must bow to the lessons of life, and even the proudest kings must kneel before truth. The eternal legacy of Richard the Lionheart is not in the castles he conquered or the gold he amassed, but in the lessons his journey teaches humanity, that strength must be tempered by mercy, courage by wisdom, and power by faith. His story stands as a reminder that the path to greatness runs not through triumph alone, but through trial, humility, and repentance. His roar may have faded long ago, but the echo of his legacy still calls out, urging every heart to rise, forgive, and live with honor. When King Richard the Lionheart departed from this world, his name did not fade into the pages of forgotten kings. His courage, faith, and leadership left a lasting mark that shaped not just the destiny of England, but the spirit of nations that would rise after him. He lived in an age when the sword defined power, yet he proved that honor could outshine fear, and that righteousness could command more loyalty than force. His influence reached beyond the battlefield. It molded the very idea of what it meant to be a true leader. Richard's life became a symbol of bravery blended with mercy, strength balanced by justice, and ambition guided by faith. One of Richard's greatest contributions was the redefinition of kingship. Before him, many rulers governed through cruelty and fear. But Richard's leadership came from example. He led from the front lines, shoulder to shoulder with his men. He didn't hide behind his title. He earned it with sweat, sacrifice, and valor that changed how rulers were seen. A king was no longer just a figure on a throne. He was a guardian of his people, a warrior for justice, and a servant to a divine purpose. That example inspired generations of leaders who sought to rule with both authority and humility. His courage in the Crusades, though surrounded by the complexities of history, became a legend of faith and resolve. Richard's name became synonymous with strength under fire, a leader who did not retreat when danger called. His strategies, endurance, and fearlessness became lessons studied for centuries in both war and leadership. Yet it wasn't just his victories that made him great. It was the grace with which he faced defeat. His imprisonment and return showed that true kingship lies not in never falling, but in rising again with dignity and patience. The Lionheart's influence also extended into the moral and cultural fabric of England. His reign inspired a sense of unity and national pride that survived long after his death. His bravery became the foundation of England's knightly spirit, the code of honor, loyalty, and faith that shaped the future of chivalry. The very term Lionheart became a title of respect, representing not just Richard himself, but an entire ideal, a heart that beats with courage and righteousness even in the darkest times. It was this ideal that continued to guide England through wars, revolutions, and renaissances. Richard's relationship with his people also redefined how rulers connected with those they governed. When he returned from captivity, he forgave those who doubted him and worked to rebuild his kingdom rather than punish. This act of mercy and understanding built trust and admiration. The people saw in him not just a monarch, but a man, one who understood struggle, forgiveness, and responsibility. That human connection became a model for leadership that went beyond royalty. It inspired generals, governors, and even modern-day leaders who learned that respect is earned through compassion, not command. Even outside England, Richard's legend spread through Europe and beyond. In France, Italy, and the Middle East, tales of the Lionheart became symbols of bravery and respect for opponents. Even those he fought recognized his honor and valor. Historians and storytellers from different cultures recorded his name with awe, showing that true greatness transcends borders. His character, brave, just, and merciful, became a universal image of leadership that crossed language and religion. His influence reached not just the Christian world, but also the broader world of history, where courage and integrity speak louder than politics. Richard's life also shaped the moral lessons of power for future generations. He demonstrated that leadership without morality is empty. Despite being surrounded by political betrayal, he chose forgiveness over vengeance and integrity over deceit. His actions taught that power is a test of one's soul, that every victory must honor truth, and every decision must reflect justice. This principle echoed through the ages, reminding rulers that true legacy lies not in how much you conquer, but in how rightly you lead. The arts and literature of later centuries immortalized Richard's image. From ballads sung by minstrels to plays, poems, and historical chronicles, he became the hero of countless tales. Yet beneath the legend was the truth, that his humanity was his greatest strength. People saw in him not a perfect man, but a striving one. His flaws and repentance made his story real. Through that, he became an eternal inspiration for those who believe that redemption and greatness can walk hand in hand. Even in the modern age, the influence of Richard the Lionheart remains alive. His statue stands proudly before the British Parliament, a symbol of courage in leadership and steadfast faith under trial. His name is invoked whenever people speak of courage, loyalty, or justice. His legacy continues to remind nations that the foundation of power must rest on righteousness, not tyranny, and that the strength of a people depends on the integrity of its leader. Ultimately, the influence of the Lionheart lies not in the land he ruled, but in the example he left. He showed that every human being, no matter how high or low, can rise through courage, faith, and forgiveness. His story teaches that real power is not about controlling others, but about conquering oneself. Richard's reign ended centuries ago, but his legacy still beats, like the heart of a lion, within every soul that dares to lead with faith, fight with honor, and forgive with grace. As King Richard the Lionheart's life neared its end, he began to reflect deeply on the meaning of his journey, the battles he had fought, the victories he had earned, and the lessons he had learned. He had been a warrior from his youth, a man who stood unshaken in the face of swords and storms. Yet in those final years the roar of battle quieted, and a deeper truth began to speak to him. He realized that while the conquest of lands brings glory for a time, the conquest of one's soul brings peace forever. His reflection became his greatest victory, one not fought on a battlefield, but within the heart. He had seen kingdoms rise and fall, armies march and crumble, and thrones turn to dust. Power that once seemed eternal faded like a sunset, and gold that once glittered lost its shine. Richard began to understand that all worldly triumphs are temporary, but faith and righteousness endure beyond time. The same courage that once drove him into battle now guided him to seek peace with his Creator. He understood that a true king is not measured by the crown on his head, but by the purity of his heart. In the quiet of his chambers, away from the noise of war, Richard often thought about the moments when pride clouded his judgment. He remembered the faces of soldiers who had followed him with loyalty, and the lives that had been lost in the name of victory. It was in these moments that humility grew within him, the realization that strength without compassion is hollow. He began to thank the Almighty for every breath, for every trial that had shaped him, and for every mercy that had guided him even when he did not see it. He had once believed that his sword was the source of his power, but now he saw that true power comes from discipline, patience, and gratitude. Every time he faced defeat and rose again, it was not his might that saved him, but divine wisdom and mercy. Richard began to teach those around him that every warrior must learn to bow, not in surrender to men, but in submission to the truth that all power belongs to the Almighty. His reflection turned his heart from battlefields to brotherhood, from conquering others to uplifting souls. The Lionheart also realized that forgiveness is the final test of courage. He had been betrayed, imprisoned, and wronged by those he trusted. Yet, in his final days, he chose forgiveness over resentment. He understood that bitterness chains the soul far more than iron chains ever could. By forgiving, he freed himself from the past and prepared his heart for peace. Those who once saw him as only a warrior now began to see him as a man of wisdom, a king who had learned that mercy is the highest form of victory. As illness slowly weakened his body, his spirit grew stronger. He no longer longed for war or glory, but for redemption and closeness to his Lord. He spoke gently to his men, urging them to live with honor, to lead with justice, and to remember that pride destroys where humility builds. He told them that kingdoms are tested not by their wealth, but by their righteousness. Those words became a guiding light for generations after him, a reminder that every empire stands firm only when its foundation is built upon truth. The final days of Richard the Lionheart were not marked by despair, but by serenity. He had walked the road of ambition and found that it led to wisdom. His victories had given him fame, but his reflection gave him peace. When he looked back on his life, he did not see a man who conquered lands. He saw a soul that had been shaped by trials, tested by faith, and refined by repentance. In his silence, he found clarity that every struggle in life is meant to bring a person closer to humility and understanding. Those who stood by him in his last moments witnessed not the roar of a lion, but the calm of a believer. His eyes carried peace, his voice carried truth, and his legacy carried faith. He left behind not just castles and crowns, but lessons written upon the hearts of those who listened. His story became a living message that strength without righteousness is fleeting, but faith and integrity carve a legacy that time cannot erase. The message of the Lionheart lives beyond the centuries, that life is not about how many battles one wins, but about how faithfully one walks through them. True power is not in domination, but in self-mastery. True honor is not in wealth, but in virtue. And true victory is not in conquering others, but in conquering one's own pride. This is what made Richard's story eternal, not his wars, but his wisdom. And so the Lionheart's final reflection became his greatest sermon to the world, that no throne lasts forever, no sword remains sharp forever, but a heart that lives with truth, courage, and faith never dies. His empire may have faded, but his example shines like a beacon, a call to every soul that the real conquest is not of lands, but of the self. That is where kings are truly crowned, and where legacies are born that time itself cannot destroy. After years of war and countless victories, King Richard the Lionheart began his journey back to England. His heart carried the pride of a warrior and the burden of responsibility that came with it. The roads were long, the lands foreign, and the dangers many. Yet he walked with the calm assurance of a man who had faced greater threats on the battlefield. His thoughts were heavy with plans for rebuilding his kingdom, restoring justice, and bringing stability to his people. But destiny had prepared one last great trial for the Lionheart, a test that would prove that true kingship is measured not by crowns or swords, but by patience and faith. As he traveled through Europe in disguise, hoping to avoid political enemies, fate intervened. One cold night in the town of Vienna, he was discovered by the soldiers of Duke Leopold of Austria, a man who had once fought beside him but now saw him as a rival. Richard was captured, betrayed by his own fame. The mighty conqueror who had led armies across continents was suddenly a prisoner, chained and held for ransom. The man who once commanded thousands now faced solitude in a dark cell. But in that darkness, Richard's light did not fade, it deepened. The news of his capture spread across Europe like wildfire. Some rejoiced, others mourned, and many feared the chaos his absence might bring. In England, his people prayed for his return, while enemies plotted to keep him away forever. Yet even in captivity, Richard's courage remained unbroken. He spoke little, prayed often, and trusted in the will of the Almighty. He knew that power given by God could not be taken by men unless it was meant to teach humility and wisdom. Days turned into months and months into years. The king who once ruled battlefields now ruled his own heart. The chains that bound him could not silence his faith. He began to see his imprisonment as a divine lesson, a moment to reflect on pride, patience, and perseverance. In the stillness of his cell, he learned that sometimes the greatest battles are fought in silence, and the greatest victories are won through endurance. Back in England, his mother, Queen Eleanor of Aquitaine, worked tirelessly to gather his ransom. She sent messages across the land, reminding nobles and commoners alike that their true king needed them. The people who had admired Richard for his bravery now saw the depth of his humanity. They gave what they could, gold, silver, and prayers, to bring him home. Their loyalty was a reflection of the love and justice he had once shown them. The bond between a true leader and his people had never been clearer. During his captivity, Richard faced interrogations, loneliness, and betrayal, yet each day his resolve grew stronger. He refused to speak ill of those who wronged him, and never let anger consume him. He understood that resentment is the enemy of wisdom. Instead, he focused on gratitude for life, for faith, and for the lessons hardship brings. Those who guarded him began to respect his composure, realizing that even in chains the Lionheart's spirit could not be tamed. The ransom demanded for his release was enormous, the largest ever requested for a king. Yet through the unity of his people and the perseverance of his family, the impossible became possible. Every coin that reached the emperor's hands was a symbol of England's love for its king. When the ransom was finally paid, Richard was brought forth, weary but unbroken. As the doors of his prison opened, he stepped out not just as a king who had been freed, but as a man who had been purified by patience. When he returned to England, his people welcomed him with tears and joy. The streets echoed with chants of loyalty and songs of triumph. The same man who had once conquered cities now conquered hearts. His return was not marked by arrogance, but by humility. He spoke to his people with gratitude, reminding them that every trial strengthens the soul, and that faith is the anchor that keeps a person standing when all else falls. Richard's captivity had changed him. He no longer saw glory in endless wars, but in righteous leadership. He understood that the Almighty had allowed him to taste both power and powerlessness to make him wiser. He realized that kingship was not about ruling over others, but about guiding them with justice, protecting them with courage, and serving them with sincerity. His imprisonment became his enlightenment, the moment that turned a warrior into a true ruler. The story of King Richard's captivity spread across nations as a tale of patience, endurance, and divine wisdom. His enemies had tried to break him, but instead they refined him. His chains became a symbol not of weakness, but of spiritual strength. The Lionheart had faced many battles, but this one, the silent battle of the soul, was his greatest victory. Through it, he proved that no prison can contain a heart that trusts in God, and no darkness can defeat a spirit guided by faith and courage. As the years passed and the battles of his life faded into memory, King Richard the Lionheart became more than a name. He became a symbol. His courage, his trials, and his transformation left a mark not only on his people, but on history itself. He had fought wars that changed nations, but more importantly, he had fought the inner war that changes the soul. Those who remembered him did not just speak of his victories on the battlefield, but of the strength and humility he discovered through hardship. The Lionheart had learned that a true legacy is not carved in stone or gold, but in the hearts of those who live by one's example. His story spread across Europe and beyond. Minstrels sang of his bravery, poets wrote of his leadership, and travelers carried his tale to distant lands. Yet, those who truly understood his journey spoke of the wisdom behind the sword, how a man of great might had been humbled and refined by the tests of life. His name became synonymous with courage, but not the reckless courage of pride. It was the courage that faces truth, endures pain, and walks with patience even in darkness. That is why his story endured long after his reign ended. After returning from captivity, Richard devoted himself to restoring order and justice in his kingdom. He focused less on conquest and more on leadership that uplifted his people. He strengthened the laws, protected the weak, and ensured that the treasury, drained by ransom, was restored through fairness rather than oppression. Every decision he made carried the wisdom born from suffering. He knew now that ruling meant serving, and that a kingdom thrives not by the fear of its people, but by their trust. His soldiers often said that Richard no longer led with his sword alone, but with his heart. Where once he was driven by the hunger for victory, now he was guided by the desire for peace. He would tell his men that glory fades, but righteousness endures, that no banner can fly forever, but truth never falls. This new perspective made him not only a stronger ruler, but also a gentler man. The roar of the Lionheart was no longer one of conquest. It had become the voice of wisdom. As he looked upon his land, Richard began to see the signs of divine purpose in every turn of his life. The victories that once swelled his pride now reminded him of God's mercy. The defeats that once crushed him now reminded him of God's wisdom. He came to understand that every triumph and every trial had been part of a greater design, shaping him into a king who would lead not only with might but with humility. He often told those close to him that every test in life carries a message if one has the patience to listen. In his final years, Richard sought not fame but peace. He spent more time in reflection than in war councils. He would walk through the gardens of his palace, looking upon the sunset with a heart that finally understood what it meant to be content. His words became gentler, his gaze softer, his heart more grateful. To those who came seeking advice, he would say, "The truest victory is over oneself." It was a statement that came from the deepest place of experience, from a man who had lived both power and captivity, glory and humility. When he fell ill, he faced it as he had faced every challenge with calmness and courage. He did not fear death, for he knew that the life he had lived was full of lessons and purpose. His faith had taught him that every soul returns to its Creator, and what matters most is not how one begins, but how one ends with sincerity, gratitude, and faith. Those who gathered around him in his final moments saw not a king fading away, but a man ascending in dignity. His strength, though no longer in his arms, shone in his serenity. After his passing, his people mourned deeply, not only for their king, but for the man he had become. His leadership had changed them, his trials had inspired them. He had shown that greatness is not in domination, but in discipline, not in conquest, but in compassion. His life became a reminder that no matter how high one rises, humility must remain the foundation. The Lionheart's story became a mirror in which every leader could see what true strength looks like. Generations after his death, his legacy continued to inspire. Warriors looked to his name for courage, rulers for guidance, and common people for hope. His journey from pride to patience, from conquest to compassion, became a timeless lesson. He had been called the Lionheart for his valor, but what made his heart truly mighty was his faith, his humility, and his understanding of life's deeper meaning. His reign had ended, but his influence endured not in the castles he built, but in the character he left behind. And so King Richard the Lionheart's story stands not as a tale of war, but of transformation. From a young warrior who sought glory to a wise ruler who sought peace, his life reflects the eternal truth that the greatest empire a man can conquer is within himself. His crown faded, his sword rusted, but his lessons remain, whispering to every soul that power without humility is empty, but humility guided by faith can make even the strongest heart eternal. King Richard's story isn't about crowns or castles, it's about faith, resilience, and redemption. It reminds us that every fall carries a lesson, every wound hides wisdom, and every defeat can become divine preparation for something greater. The Lionheart's legacy lives on because he proved one truth. When you rule your soul, no power on earth can rule you. So remember, legends aren't born in comfort. They are forged in struggle, in patience, and in faith. The world may forget your name, but not your story, because heroes never forget their revenge. They transform it into purpose.